Sawubona. I learned this greeting from the philosopher Mogobe Ramose. He's born in South Africa, but he lived in exile in Belgium and the Netherlands for more than 20 years. And when I asked him which part of the Dutch culture he found most difficult to get used to, he said the word hello. It's not really greeting each other. It's so short. In our language, he said, we use the word Sawubona. It means I see you. I will come back to this later in the lecture, but let me introduce myself first. I went to the Gambia for the first time when I was 21, and from the moment I set foot on the African continent, I felt as coming home. Later, during my postdoctoral research, I had the opportunity to live for 2 years in Mozambique. And I realized that there is a lot of wisdom in the villages in Africa, but our projects did not include that wisdom. When I returned to the Netherlands, I learned about African philosophy. And I realized that that was the knowledge that I had missed. I wish I had learned that knowledge before I went to Africa. And so I went back to the university here in Wageningen, where I did my master and my PhD. I knocked on the door and I said, maybe we need a course on African philosophy. Thankfully, I was given the opportunity to develop a course on this topic, and I designed it in the way as I would have liked to have had it as a student. First to say is that I draw all my lectures and my courses. And all these illustrations come together in a visual mind map, or in this case, a roadmap to African philosophy. Philosophical concepts can be quite abstract, and the illustrations can help to give a better understanding. So today I'm going to give you a little insight in this course, and we focus on the question of knowledge diversity. What is knowledge diversity? You can imagine this as pieces of the puzzle that we bring together. But the question is, how do we deal with that? What kind of knowledges do we bring together? What do we include and what do we exclude? The question of that is called epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice, the first part, epistemic, has to do with epistemologies. Epistemologies deals with questions in philosophy and asks questions like, what is real knowledge? What counts as knowledge? The injustice part has to do with which knowledge is included or excluded, and on basis of what grounds. So to give a full description in an African context, epistemic injustice would be the systematic exclusion and structural oppression of African ways of knowing and doing. It's important to realize that epistemic injustice is not restricted to only Africa. This happens across the globe. What you could say is that actually the Western part, the Western knowledge, the piece of the puzzle that we bring in from the West is seen as most important and most significant, especially Western academic knowledge. It's also important to realize that this is not only for universities in the Netherlands or in Europe, but also universities in Africa. Most of the curriculum is actually Western knowledge. But it's no coincidence that the knowledge taught at universities is largely Western. This goes back to periods of slavery and colonialism. No need to say that in those days, indigenous knowledge of African peoples was considered inferior. And even though colonialism has formally ended in terms of the political independence of these countries, there is still a form of colonial thinking. And that's what we see, for example, in ideas where we say that Africa lags behind, in which Western knowledge is superior, and like our projects, where we thought that Western knowledge was needed to solve problems in Africa. The problem is that we perpetuate epistemic injustice by doing that. Colonial legacies also exist until today in education. They are visible in the literature we select, the authors we choose, the questions we ask, and the words we use. Or actually, it's not visible. The colonial legacies are precisely visible in the literature we do not select, the authors we do not choose, the questions we not ask, the words we do not use, the students we do not hear, and the teachers we do not hire. We do this on purpose. It's not a coincidence. We have a choice to include the knowledge we want in our education. But it does lead to a blindness or an ignorance of African philosophy. Why do we all know Socrates? And why have we not heard of Urmila? It's this willful blindness that the same philosopher I just mentioned, Mogobe Ramose, is what we are perpetuating here. But we need to undo the colonial legacies. So undoing colonial legacies largely has to do with including the voices and the knowledge that have previously been excluded. So the question is, how do we bring in different pieces of the puzzle? How do we create that knowledge diversity? And also, which voices, which knowledge has been excluded so far? One of these historically oppressed voices is African philosophy, as we find it in Ubuntu. The philosopher I just mentioned, Professor Mogobe Ramose, is a very influential writer in and on Ubuntu philosophy. And to briefly introduce to you, there is this famous proverb that says, Umuntu numuntu nabantu, which can be translated as to be human, is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others and on that basis enter into human relations. In the popular version, it would be translated as I am because we are. And while this gives a direction of the meaning, it's also often misused because the concept is becoming more and more popular. And we have to be careful of knowledge appropriation, that those of us in the West take what they want from an indigenous knowledge without a careful consideration of what the concept actually means, without a truly understanding. So Ubuntu is about learning to become human. It's about creating relationships with the community. And it's important to realize that this community consists of the living, but also the living dead, often called the ancestors, and the yet to be born, the future generation. So we could summarize this in the importance of relationality. That's a key term there. And that's why I said Sawubona at the start of this lecture, because Sawubona is an invitation to connect to each other and to really greet each other as human beings. Ubuntu is not limited to the community of people. It also includes Mother Nature. And the purpose of Ubuntu is not to accumulate wealth, especially not on an individual level, but the purpose of Ubuntu is to make connections and also to maintain connections with nature and to have a balance in these relations and to maintain them. So that does mean that we as humans can use nature for human purposes, like food production, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we should exploit it. It means that we have a respectful relation with Mother Nature, a relation of reciprocity where we give sufficient time for nature to recover for a next, for example, harvest. So the basis of this is respect for Mother Earth. This is different from the mainstream Western philosophy, especially when we look to our own relation of nature and how we have been able to exploit nature over these past decades. If we want to learn from historically oppressed voices, there is an important lesson we learn from the same Mogobe Ramose. We have to look into the mirror, especially when we know we are ugly. What this means is we have to face our colonial legacies. We need to do that with critical self-reflection. Self-reflection among students and teachers. And that also counts for me as a teacher here in Wageningen University. I have a Dutch educational background. And that means I cannot and do not want to speak for African colleagues. That immediately highlights a problem with this particular talk because you only see me. It's an individual talk. But knowledge is not individual. I work very closely together with many dear African colleagues. So I do not represent these African colleagues. We read the texts, they provide guest lectures, and we engage in dialogue. As I mentioned with Mogobe Ramose, also with Michael Eze, Beatrice Ochere-Manu, and then there is Pius Musima, who is currently co-teaching African philosophy with us here in Wageningen. What we do then is actually bringing the intercultural dialogue into practice. We bring it into the classroom. And that's precisely what is important to realize when we think about how do we engage with these knowledges in a respectful way. And this is where we have a lot to learn and move into a dialogue. A dialogue invites us to listen. This is very different from what we are used to do in academia. We very often are trained to debate and to convince the other from our point of view. Instead, when we have a dialogue, we really want to learn from each other. And we listen with an open mind and an open heart. We do not think in terms of right or wrong, but we think of terms of different and where we can learn from each other. This so-called methodology of listening has been developed by the intercultural philosopher Heinz Kimmele. He passed away, but he was a pioneer in intercultural philosophy, especially in relation to African philosophy. He was one of the first philosophers in the 1990s to engage in dialogue with his African colleagues, and as such treated African philosophy with respect as an equal dialogue partner. He was a pioneer in intercultural philosophy. What we also learned from him and from this talk is that we need a diversity of knowledges to deal with the problems that we are facing in the world today. Questions as climate crisis cannot be dealt with one knowledge only. And that's precisely what brings me to the importance of this course in Wageningen. As one of the students of the course said, actually everybody in Wageningen should take this course. And maybe that is the reason also why the course is so popular nowadays. It's being followed at this moment by students in 26 different study programs. It shows that students want to learn from different epistemologies, from different types of knowledge than only the Western ones. So there is much for us to learn and much for us to further develop in education. This is not an individual task. This is a collective mission for us teachers and students across the globe to connect the knowledges and learn from each other. Thank you.